Alright, A-Pushers, welcome back to another episode of Mr. B History, your source for all the AP US history knowledge and chapter notes. This one is Chapter 21, The Progressive Era, Part 2. Political, economic, and social reform. When I say progressive, you say reform. We got the dates of 1901 to 1917, and let's get straight to that knowledge. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go for real. All right, political reform. Political reform in the nation. Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. This is at the national level. Teddy Roosevelt starts off with a square deal. He thought it was the president's job to set the legislative agenda. Fun fact, Teddy Roosevelt is the youngest person to be president at 42 years old. JFK is the youngest elected president sworn in at the age of 43. Teddy Roosevelt, was not elected. He was president because of assassination. So, a little fun fact for you right there. You don't need to write that one down, but still a fun fact. Square deal refers to square being like all fair and square. And deal means a deck of cards, like you're dealing the cards, not like let's make a deal. So he insisted on a square or fair deal for both labor and business. So this idea of having a deal, like a deal of cards, is going to come back later on when we have the New Deal, which will be Franklin D. Roosevelt's thing, and then we'll go from there. He sided with the laborers in a strike and threatened federal action against the mine company if they didn't negotiate. They were striking at the mine company, and he called them in there and was like, you better negotiate. And they were like, no. And he was like, oh yeah, well you better, because I'm Teddy Roosevelt. Trust busting. This leads him off into trust busting. He's known as a trust buster. A trust is the same thing as a monopoly, so make sure you don't get that confused. He's the first president to actually enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Took him all the way till 1901 to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act. He busted railroad monopolies in over 40 large corporations, including the Standard Oil Company. He differentiated between good trusts and bad trusts. So the bad trusts that he wanted to bust harmed the public and reduced competition, whereas he saw some good trusts that were efficient and had low prices, so that was helpful to the people. Railroad regulations. He strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission with the Elkins Act, and it's stupid. Stopped rebates. That should be stopped rebates, not stopped. Stopped rebates. And the Hepburn Act set reasonable prices. Make sure you add an D, and that stopped. Consumer protection. The jungle. So corral the corporations, care for the consumer, and conservationism. That's the three C's of Teddy Roosevelt. So consumer protection is the second one. The muckraker Upton Sinclair wrote a book exposing the nasty conditions of the meatpacking industry called The Jungle. He really wrote it to highlight the plight of Lithuanian immigrants, but people read it and were disgusted and demanded that the government do something about it. And the response was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which forbade the making, sale, and transport of unadulterated or mislabeled food and drugs. And then the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, the same year. Federal inspectors visit meat packing plants and ensure they meet minimum sanitation standards. They also grade the meat, like grade A, grade B, grade C, grade D, or failing. Hopefully you're passing. All right, conservation. Teddy Roosevelt loved the outdoor woods and took steps to conserve nature for future generations. The Federal Reserve Act of 1891 keep 150 million acres as natural forest. The Newlands Reclamation Act, irrigation for wetlands, and created the U.S. Forest Service and created national parks. So this is where he gets the name. This is where teddy bears get the name from, because he loved outdoor woods so much. They like, we should make a bear. We'll call it a teddy bear, after Theodore Roosevelt. William Howard Taft. Following Teddy Roosevelt was William Howard Taft. Used to be best friends, hand-picked successor. So Roosevelt was like, who should I have as my hand-picked successor? And he picked William Howard Taft. And he told William Howard Taft, just do the same thing I'm just going to do and you'll do fine. And so that's exactly what William Howard Taft did. He did more trust busting and more conservation. Taft continued Roosevelt's progressive policies, busted twice as many trusts as Roosevelt, established a Bureau of Mines, and added thousands of acres to the forest reserves. He passed the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910, further strengthening the Interstate Commerce Commission to include control over the telephone, telegraph, and cable companies. And under his presidency, they passed the 16th Amendment, which was a graduated income tax, which at first only applied to the very, very, very wealthy, so it was applauded by most people. The 16th Amendment, a graduated income, very, 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 very important. This is something that the populists wanted way back in the 1890s. Split in the Republican Party. The Progressives, by the end of Progressive's 4 years in office, the Progressives accused Taft of becoming more conservative instead of a progressive. So he entered and he was supposed to be a progressive like Roosevelt, and they claimed that he was conservative, and this split the Republican Party, mostly because of these things. Number one, the Payne-Aldrich tariff. Taft had promised to lower the tariff like a good progressive, but approved the higher tariff in 1909. The Pinstroke Ballinger controversy. Taft fired Pinstroke, a progressive conservationist, and supported Richard Ballinger, who opened public land to development in Alaska. House Speaker Joe Cannon, the leading conservative, and Taft did not support in limiting his power. The progressives were mad about that. The midterm elections, Taft supported conservative candidates, and they all lost to the progressives. This is going to set up not the rise of the Socialist Party, it's going to set up the election of 1912. But before we get to that, the rise of the Socialist Party of America. It was a third party dedicated to the welfare of the working class. That's the only thing they cared about. Much like the populists only cared about the farmers, the socialists only care about the working class. They advocated for radical reforms such as government ownership of railroads, utilities, and major industries such as oil and steel. That's right, the government was going to own the oil companies and the steel companies. The most famous of the socialists was none other than Eugene V. Debs. That should be a period. Eugene V. Debs. Not a comma. Period. Eugene V. Debs was famous for being a labor leader. He was jailed during the Pullman strikes, and while he was in jail, he turned into a socialist in jail. He ran for president 5 times, lost every time, but was a champion of labor. One time, fun fact, I didn't put it in as a fun fact, but fun fact, he ran from jail. He ran for president from jail and got like 1 million votes. Socialist ideas that were adopted by major political parties. They never have a chance of winning, but some ideas that they had that eventually are adopted by the other two political parties are public ownership of utilities, the 8-hour workday, and retirement pensions for employees. The election of 1912. The famous election of 1912. The crazy election of 1912. The candidates. Republican, William Howard Taft, running for president for a second term. He's a conservative Republican. Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. He's a progressive. Progressive Republicans formed a third party called the Bull Moose Party and chose Teddy Roosevelt. And then, as a fourth wild card, Socialist Eugene V. Debs run for president too. So you have 4 people running for president, 2 third parties, the Socialists and the Bull Moose Party. The Socialists drawing away some votes from the Democrats, and the Bull Moose Party splitting the Republican ticket. The campaign, Roosevelt's New Nationalism, more government regulation, women's suffrage and social welfare versus Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom, limit big business and government by fighting corruption and supporting small business. The result, Woodrow Wilson only won 42% of the popular vote. That's not even close to half. But he won the election anyway. So more people voted for not Woodrow Wilson, but somehow, 58% of the people voted not for Woodrow Wilson, but yet Woodrow Wilson wins the election. This is the other result of third parties. Third parties can take away votes from the major political parties, and in this case, Roosevelt took half the Republican votes. He got more votes than Taft, but neither one, which they each got around 30% of the vote, maybe a little bit less, like 28% of the vote. But that means that Woodrow Wilson won. He was a minority president. Most people did not vote for him. But that doesn't stop him from doing tons of things. Woodrow Wilson's progressivism. Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat from the South. He was from Virginia. He was intellectual. He was the president of Princeton University. He was idealistic. That means he really, really had some ideas and he stuck to it. He was righteous and inflexible, and he attacked the triple wall of privilege. The triple wall of privilege was tariff the banks and monopolies and trusts. So the first thing he's going to do is reduce the tariff. This was accomplished by the Underwood Tariff, which lowered the tariff for the first time in 50 years. Replace lost revenue with an increase in the graduated income tax because you still got to make that money. Banking reform. The Federal Reserve Act of 1914 created 12 regional banks of the United States that could print money. Dollar bills, y'all. The Federal Reserve, it's like a national bank, but it's not a national bank. It's like a cross between a state bank and a national bank. So it's 12 national banks. This is going to solve the problem that we've had all the way since the Federalists when they first created the national bank, and the Democratic Republicans did not like it. And then Jackson killed the national bank, and now Woodrow Wilson brings it back, kind of. Business regulation. They bust monopolies and trusts using the Clayton Antitrust Act and the Federal Trade Commission. Other reforms. This guy is progressive through and through. He's reforming and reforming and reforming and reforming and reforming and reforming. The Federal Farm Loan Act. Banks would loan money to farmers at a low interest rate. The Child Labor Act, which banned the shipment of goods made by anyone under the age of 14, even though it was ruled unconstitutional. And that's fine because we learned in the other progressive area that mandatory public education is going to pretty much get rid of child labor. African Americans of the progressive era. Few progressives did anything about segregation and lynching. Not so fun fact, Woodrow Wilson was racist. Remember, he was from the South, and this was part of his upbringing. No excuses. Still a racist. Two approaches. Alleviate poverty or focus on civil rights. Booker T. Washington was the focus on economics. He was head of the Tuskegee University in Alabama. He was a former slave. He said, learn industrial skills for better wages and then try to get social and political equality. W.E.B. Du Bois, focus on civil rights, wrote The Souls of the Black Folks, criticized Booker T, and argued for political and social equality before economic independence. He became president of the NAACP, that's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons. The Great Migration. African Americans moving from the rural South to the urban North because, number one, discrimination, segregation, and lynching that was taking place in the South. Why would you stay there? Number two, the boll weevil. The boll weevil destroys the cotton crops. 3, job opportunities in the northern factories, especially during World War I. So this great migration of hundreds of thousands of African Americans moving from the South to the North takes place over several decades. Civil rights organizations, the Niagara Movement, 1905, Du Bois and his boys joined together to create a civil rights organization in 1905. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, 1908. The NAACP was a mixed-race civil rights group, largest in the nation. By mixed race, we mean blacks and whites working together for civil rights. You love to see it. National Urban League, 1911, formed to help people migrating from the South to the North. Not alms, but opportunity was the quote. Emphasis on self-reliance and economic development or advancement. This is going to sound familiar in the 1920s. Women, suffrage, and the progressives. The campaign for women's suffrage, new generation of feminists looked for support from male progressives, but was ignored by Woodrow Wilson. Boo. Eventually, though, Woodrow Wilson would pay attention to him after World War I. Carrie C. Catt, president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA, N-A-W-S-A, militant suffragist. They were not happy just to ask politely, so they did pickets, parades, and hunger strikes. Alice Paul formed the National Women's Party in 1916, wanted a constitutional amendment to guarantee women's right to vote. The 19th Amendment, 1920. The efforts of women during World War I contributes to the Congress approving the 19th Amendment. Women's right to vote in all elections. Expanding the democratic process. Other issues, Margaret Sanger, eugenics, Planned Parenthood, birth control, education for poor people, and economic equality. And that is the end. You know what they say about these progressive notes? 15 minutes could earn you 15 points or more on your next test and quiz.